So is the mic on? It is on. Thank you all for attending so early in the morning on a Sunday. There we are. So, was Buddha just a nice guy? This is a version of a talk I've given that is related to my new book, Supernormal, but I've customized it for the SAND audience. We might also think of this as a tale of two cities, except not spelled that way, spelled this way. And if I had found a book that was a tale of three cities, I would have used that, because I'm actually going to talk about three cities and not just two. So let's begin with two non-dualities. One non-duality is materialism. The other non-duality is idealism. The idealism picture comes from Burning Man, and you'll see why that becomes relevant in a little bit. Materialism we can think of as a knowledge pyramid, and the bottom of the pyramid is something like space and time, and then we have energy light and energy dense, otherwise known as matter and energy. That emerges into atoms and molecules, the chemistry to biology, and somewhere in the top is psychology and the mind. And that within this pyramid, it's understood that things emerge from lower levels. And so we know that space and time permeates everything above, and energy permeates everything above, and so on. So there's materialism. It has aspects which are good, bad, and ugly. The good part of materialism is that it has given rise to predictive models, some of which are very accurate, and to technologies. So it gives us a confidence that the models are correct. So that's the good part. There are also some bad parts to materialism, one of which is this. It leads to a kind of nihilistic view of the world. I love the subtitle here under atheist. It says, "Shoving nothing in your face." So that's one of the consequences. Of course, there are many other consequences of materialism that are not so good. And then there's what I would call the ugly part of materialism, which is that it doesn't account very well for the fact that we're conscious, or worse, for things related to consciousness that materialism really cannot handle at all, including things like psychic and mystical experience. So the reason why, from a mainstream perspective, that these phenomena are excluded or denied is because the knowledge pyramid, as I built it up, has mind at the very top and has space and time at the bottom. And even though we know that there's very strange, slippery stuff going on at the lower level, it seems so far away from where the mind supposedly emerges that there's no way you can make sense of psychic and mystical experience, because those experiences are strange for one reason. They seem to transcend space and time. And the other thing is that materialism reinforces our sense of separateness, that we clearly have separate bodies, we have to move them around separate ways, but is that all there is? And that's something that materialism reinforces all the time. So let's look then at idealism. One way of thinking of idealism, and by the way, the reason why idealism usually as a philosophy is rejected out of hand is because it can easily lead to solipsism, and in which case it's easy to argue against solipsism because we're here, things seem to be real here. So the version of idealism that I would propose looks exactly the same as materialism, with one new addition, namely that the whole thing sits on top of awareness. So this is not a new idea. This is the essence of the Vedas and practically every mystical tradition there's ever been. And so we would imagine that somehow we emerge from awareness into space and time and into energy and matter and so on. We keep building up the knowledge pyramid. How do you get from pure awareness into the physical world? There are many proposals. The one that I like is The Laws of Form by G. Spencer Brown, but there have been a couple of people at this conference already, like Don Hoffman the other day, talking about how you would start with something like just a field of void or pure awareness. You make a distinction and allow recursion to occur, and the whole universe comes out of that. So just as with materialism, the bottom level permeates everything, in which case awareness becomes inherent at every stage of this pyramid. And now when we go to mind, we would say there are aspects of mind that have this pure primordial awareness in it, and that is prior to space-time. So the other nice thing about this way of thinking about it is that it doesn't require us to throw the textbooks away. This is one of the fears that I see among scientists who have bought completely into the standard materialistic point of view, that they say what you're talking about, namely usually psychic experience, cannot be true, because if it was true, then we'd have to throw away the physics textbooks and everything else. And I'm saying, no, all of the textbooks would remain the same. They would still have to be revised every 6 months because science evolves. But the essence of it remains the same. All you're doing is expanding it and making it a little bit more comprehensive. And the more comprehensive aspect of it would give rise to other kinds of phenomena that are not usually thought about. So awareness permeates this version of idealism. Nothing is written in stone, except for this nice recursion, which is chiseled into stone. And so let's simply have a couple of postulates based on this model of idealism. First of all, awareness is more fundamental than space, time, matter, or energy. If that is true, especially if it's true for time, then it should be the case that through awareness you can see past, present, and future, because awareness is before space-time. The second postulate is that awareness is unitary. There's just one mind. And a nice book on this that just came out by Larry Dawsey is called One Mind, and basically captures all of the lore about the idea of one mind from many different traditions. It's a good resource. So if that were true, there's just one mind ultimately, then occasionally people should share mind stuff. In other words, there should be something like telepathy. The third postulate is that the physical world emerges from awareness. If that's true, then there should be a way in which awareness occasionally changes our perception, or not only the perception, but changes the actual physical world, the way that it manifests. In which case you can be Neo and bend spoons simply by adjusting your awareness of it. So what does this have to do with asking the question, was Buddha just a nice guy? Well, it's relevant because if this is the view of the mind, which is the way the neuroscientists think about the mind today, then there's no room for Buddha to be anything other than a nice guy. And we don't even know if he was a nice guy. Probably was nice. He smiled a lot. So probably nice. But there would be nothing else with Buddha or anyone else of his style. And so when we hear stories about, in this case, Buddha levitating in a pillar of flame above his disciples, we can only understand that as hagiography. This is the embellished lives of the saints. They're stories. Or Jesus walking on water, or Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea. These become powerful stories, but from a modern, secular, scientific viewpoint, we would look at that and say, well, you know, they're useful for manipulating people's ideas, but they're not really true. And as a result, we get responses like this. So you say, well, yeah, the Red Sea parted, but it was a fluke. Or, I'm glad my name's not thou. Or this sort of thing where you get something between Jesus and the Mona Lisa and Mother Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich. This particular grilled cheese sandwich was sold on eBay for $30,000 and was bought by a casino in Las Vegas. And the miracle of this grilled cheese sandwich was not only that Jesus appeared in it, but that a bite that was taken out of it miraculously healed itself, and so you can't see the bite anymore. And by the way, if you want to see dozens and dozens of versions of this kind of picture, there's a website called StuffThatLooksLikeJesus.com. If you're too busy to meditate, you can try the Buddha patch. Achieve enlightenment while cleaning your toilet. Also available in capsule, gel, and suppository. And then my favorite is this. If there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? So I use these are funny, but they're only funny in a context where we have a secular and a skeptical view of religious ideas. Because if this were a fundamentalist group, there would be things thrown at me for making fun of this stuff. But it shows then how difficult it is for us to accept some of the ideas that come out of the mystical tradition in particular as possibly really being true. And so we need to think about these things in a different way. So the way that I approached it in my latest book is on taking the Yoga Sutras as one of the traditions that talks about these things. So the Yoga Sutras are all about samadhi, which is a very deep form of absorption. It might be thought of as an initial stage of mystical insight. Through practice of the siddhis and special methods, you develop the siddhis, which are the yoga superpowers. The siddhi is a Sanskrit word meaning perfection or attainment as a result of disciplined practice. And the third book of the Yoga Sutras, Vibhuti-pada, is talking about the technique that is used to develop these methods. All of it is predicated on being able to achieve the meditative state of samadhi. I've been meditating for a number of years now, and I've achieved samadhi for a total of about 4 seconds, I think. But you need to be able to sustain samadhi for as long as you wish to get to the first stage in this kind of practice. So it's very rare in our society, if you have to do things like have a job and drive a car, to be able to sustain this level of awareness, which is one of the reasons why we don't see the superpowers that are described in legends. So the Yoga Sutra says in Book 3, Sutras 19 and 20, that there should be knowledge of minds. Well, in the modern world, we can test this, and so an experiment that has been developed and tested now for about 40 years is called the Ganzfeld telepathy technique, and it consists of taking a subject, in this case it's a lady named Gail. We put half a ping pong ball over each eye, we tape it on her eye and ask her to keep her eyes open, and then we shine a red light in her face. So if you can imagine with your eyes open, all you can see everywhere is just red. We also have her wear headphones, so she only hears white noise, and she sits in a comfy chair. And after being in this state for about 10 minutes, you begin to hallucinate. Very similar to the hypnagogic state that you would achieve just as you're falling asleep. And this is intentional. We want to pull the person away from their ordinary state of awareness and put them into a highly receptive state where their brain becomes starved for some kind of pattern because all they're looking at is red and they're not hearing anything. So my research assistant, Lena, is setting up Gail in this picture. So in the experiment, we set up beforehand 4 pictures which are as different from each other as we can manage. And one of the 4 will be telepathically sent to Gail. And Gail will then look at the 4 and try to figure out which one matched her impression. So we know by design that the odds against chance of getting the correct one is 1 in 4. If there's no telepathy, the best she can ever do is 1 in 4. So here's what Gail said while she's in this state called the Ganzfeld state. Something has a rough texture, tall, looking up high. Remember, Gail knows nothing about what target is being sent and doesn't know what the 4 pictures are either. Like in an art gallery or in a museum, a Yosemite kind of a tall rock, monolithic, images of Mount Rushmore, half dome, like a big stone. So if you were Gail and you had those experiences and now you're shown these 4 pictures, which one would you think might be the target that was being sent to you telepathically? Right, the pyramid. So this is an example of one trial in this kind of experiment. It takes generally 60 to 90 minutes from beginning to end. So there's a huge amount of effort by multiple people to get one data point. And it collapses all of Gail's experience into a single point. So this is done for the sake of ending up with very, very simple statistics. And so fortunately, there are now 4,674 sessions, of which I showed you 1, and 122 experiments conducted in 20 laboratories around the world over 40 years. So here's chance, this dotted line. And you can see then where the result of each experiment is in terms of the hit rate, where 25% is chance expectation. And I'm going to show you the same graph in terms of a cumulative average rather than each separate experiment. And now you can see that cumulatively we're pretty far away from chance. It's about 32% rather than 25%. The odds against chance of ending up there rather than chance is 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. This has been discussed repeatedly in the academic psychological literature for a number of years, starting in 1994. So this has been discussed and critically appraised within the academic world. When you have odds against chance of 300 trillion quadrillion to 1, it addresses what is a valid skeptical concern about extraordinary evidence. If you're making an extraordinary claim, it's only extraordinary because of an assumption that materialism is completely true and nothing else is true. Well, this is extraordinary evidence. Whenever you do an experiment of this type, and one of the reasons why I like the kind of work that I do is because when you present evidence that is contrary or countering what the mainstream accepts, it has to be much better. It has to be, there's a higher bar to achieve, so the methods have to be better, the attention to detail has to be better, and for me it's just a better challenge of doing science better. So we look through all of the possible ways we can think of, and skeptics over the years have thought of how can you explain the results that we see in these experiments. And you go through the due diligence list, and the one thing that you can't do as a single experimenter is ask about replication. Well, we saw that there are 20 labs doing this, and they replicate, but it then boils down to, well, what if somebody did it who really did not believe in telepathy at all? And I have to say, before I started doing these experiments, I didn't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I didn't know if telepathy existed, but I allowed the data to bring me into a direction that says it probably exists, because otherwise it's hard to explain these data. Nevertheless, are there people who absolutely still don't believe any of this and will do these experiments? And the answer is most of the time no. Because if you don't believe in something, why would you spend the time to go ahead and look at it? Fortunately, there were a pair of psychologists who explicitly said that they did not believe in any kind of psychic ability, but they went ahead and did the same kind of Ganzfeld experiment anyway. And so they report, after 8 studies, we had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which is exactly what you see when you look at the overall database. Well, they didn't like this. And so because it was precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. So the power of your prior idea is so strong that even if you go ahead and do the experiment and get exactly the same result that everyone else got, and presumably you do it as best as you can, that's still not sufficient to push your belief. So what's becoming more popular now in psychology and a few other areas is Bayesian statistics, which takes into account the prior beliefs and expectations about the people doing research. And it's very clear from Bayesian statistics that if you start with a prior belief that is very close to zero about something, then no amount of additional information could ever change your mind. If you start from anything other than close to zero, the evidence will push you. But a lot of people are already starting with basically zero. They don't believe any of it, in which case, at that point, it's not science anymore. Because if data can't change your opinion, then what are you doing? So what about telepathy? The Yoga Sutra says telepathy exists. Experiments say that telepathy exists. And now we have music confirming that telepathy exists. That was perfect timing. So we have converging, repeatable evidence that telepathy exists beyond a reasonable doubt. I mentioned one class of experiments called the Ganzfeld, which, by the way, is a German word meaning whole field. There's also another class of experiments called DMILs, which means direct mental interactions with living systems. And this is looking at phenomena where you're not consciously reporting that you're connected with somebody else, but there is a physiological change. So the easy way of thinking of it is the feeling of being stared at. So this kind of experiment has been many, many times. A meta-analysis shows very clearly that people can detect when they're being stared at without any sensory cues that they're actually being stared at. I have the sense I'm being stared at now, but I wouldn't call that telepathy. And then another class of experiments, which again is pointing towards telepathy, are studies looking at EEG measures on two people who are isolated at a distance. And so you stimulate one and you see whether the other person's brain responds. And this has also been done in functional MRIs, and basically that whole range of studies again show that even at a basic neurological level that there are connections between people at a distance. So telepathy exists. The bartender says we don't serve time travelers here. A time traveler walks into a bar. So the second thing is Yoga Sutra 16, Book 3, Knowledge of Past, Present, and Future. Is there any evidence for that? Well, 2 years ago, the New York Times warned us to prepare to be outraged because of an experiment that suggested that precognition was real. And you saw part of that is it's craziness, pure craziness. I can't believe a major journal is allowing this work in, said Ray Hyman, a lifelong critic of this work. And the study was by Darrell Bem, published in a well-regarded journal of personality and social psychology. He reported 9 studies, which overall had odds against chance of 1 billion to 1 in favor of a form of precognition. So this did create an outrageous outroar among many scientists who wondered why would this journal publish something which was obviously not possible. Fortunately, some scientists were intrigued because it is a good journal and Darrell's a very careful experimenter, and so they started to do replications. What you may have heard over the course of about the last year were a couple of people who had published studies which failed. And so there's like a big sigh of relief among the scientific community saying, well, it wasn't replicated, so it must have been a fluke. What they don't know is that they're not looking in the right place. They don't know that people have been tracking the total number of replications. When you do a meta-analysis, you have to include all possible data. So our colleagues from Italy, France, England, and the US have found 81 replications from 30 laboratories in 13 countries. Overall, there's a positive effect at greater than 6 sigma. The Higgs boson was recently got the Nobel Prize, Higgs meaning, for an effect that was just slightly under 6 sigma. I don't think a Nobel Prize will be given for this, but here we have a 6 sigma effect showing with probabilities of 10 to the minus 10th that actually this effect is repeatable independently in many laboratories. This paper has not come out yet. It's been submitted to journals which quickly reject it, but eventually it will be published and we'll see that actually the effect is repeatable. So there's another way of looking at precognition, which I call presentiment, which is an unconscious form of precognition. And basically every psychic phenomena that we know of, we typically know of it because people report it. So it has some aspect of it has to be conscious. But we know that our conscious awareness is a very thin slice of what you're actually aware of. So in the modern era, meaning 40 years ago to today, a lot of experiments in psychic phenomena are looking at unconscious forms of these same kinds of psychic effects. That's the experiment that Darrell Bem did. It actually is looking at an implicit form of precognition, and this one does as well. So here we're looking at what is going on inside the brain of meditators to basically to explicitly test what Patanjali said, that meditators getting to a certain point of awareness can perceive past, present, and future. Advanced meditators oftentimes will say that they get into a timeless place, a timeless state, which suggests that they are kind of looking through time. So what we do is we've got 8 advanced meditators, 8 controls with no experience in meditation, and the joke here is that I live in Northern California, and it was easy to find the meditators, and it was very difficult to find controls. But nevertheless, we happened to do it. And in fact, we collected the data for most of this experiment at a SANDS conference a couple of years ago. This is in the hotel at the conference. And I'm going to skip over all the details here and just say that the basic idea is that for people who are non-meditators, controls, at some point, an unpredictable future for them, they will get a stimulus. It's either a light flash or an audio tone. And we look at what's happening in their brain 1 second before. And so this is showing that 0 is when the stimulus occurs, and 1 second, even up to 2 seconds before, and the controls, there's no change in their brain, but in meditators, there is. So these envelopes here, these are 1 standard error envelopes. This is a very significant difference in just 1 electrode, and we actually found it in many electrodes. So we can see where in the brain this effect is occurring. So as of 2011, there have been 49 replications of experiments of this type from many different countries, including Iran. 26 of them fit an inclusion criteria in a meta-analysis. And the results, again, these are all gazillions to 1 against chance. And even using a Bayes statistical method, the results in favor of actual precognition is 10 to the 13th. This was done by Patrizio Tresoli in Italy and Julia Musbridge and her colleagues, and Julia is back out there somewhere. What happens if you look at all 49 replications? And I'm putting this now in terms of z-scores, or if you're a physicist, in terms of sigma. Well, it accumulates up to about 9 sigma at this point, 3.1 quintillion to 1, the odds against chance. So precognition exists. What about Sutra 3, 44, and 45, which is mastery over the elements? This is where we start talking about Superman kinds of stuff. Do or not do. There is no try. And at this part, I couldn't resist. Justin Bieber, you enjoy? Kill yourself, you must. For the Justin Bieber fans, I apologize. And for Justin, if you're watching. So what we do in the laboratory to test this idea of mastery over the elements, it's psychokinesis, it's mind-matter interactions. The tool that has been used most frequently is a random number generator. This is an electronic device, as you see, that is designed to produce truly independent bits, 0s and 1s, in sequence. This is Bob John and Brenda Dunn at Princeton, and for almost 30 years they were doing experiments of this type, along with many other people. And basically what you see is that if you give somebody the intention to make more 1s or more 0s, that the system behaves that way. And if you don't give them any instructions to push it, then it behaves close to what you'd expect by chance. So somehow these physical devices are being modulated, the physical world's being modulated, as Patanjali said, not in the form of creating diamonds out of nothing, but we still see it under very highly controlled conditions. This has been reported. I wrote an article in Foundations of Physics, and we've also talked about it in Psychological Bulletin. So again, this also is in the mainstream literature. What I've been doing for the past 5 years is a study that's taking advantage of what's sometimes called a quantum observer effect. And this has to do with the idea that the information that you know about a quantum system changes its behavior. It's most classically seen in a double slit experiment. And the way it works is if you have a double slit and you send a photon through it, you'll get a certain pattern of interference light and dark bands, but only if you're not looking. The moment you look and you actually know what the path was that was taken by the photon or the electron, you get a very different description. You get a path, a pattern that looks as though you're dealing with particles rather than waves. So this is very well understood. And all we did was we said, what would happen if we asked people purely mentally to imagine that they could see the particles? So this then becomes a combination of a mind-matter interaction experiment, in this case mind and light, and also an experiment in clairvoyance, because we're asking people to put their mind somewhere else, inside a sealed box over there, and to gain information out of it. So it's both looking at both phenomena at the same time. So that's the task. That's what the box looks like. The laser is kind of sticking out the end there. The double slit is inside the metal box. The metal box here is a 1/4 inch of aluminum, which has been machined out so that it's absolutely solid and light tight. And I'm, again, skipping over lots of information here, but basically saying that what we'd predict in this case is something like consciousness collapsing the wave function, in which case the pattern that we see would have less double slit aspects in it and when people are paying attention. And this would give a negative number, and that's why when under the observed condition, we would expect a negative number, and in fact, we get negative numbers. This is again in terms of z-scores or sigma. And when you run the same experiment when nobody's looking at anything, you get results that are very close to chance. When we separate the meditators from the non-meditators, most of the action, odds of 300,000 to 1, are due to the meditators. Now, I don't think this is not because meditators are anointed with a special magic, but because they're able to do the task. That these tasks, in fact, all of the tasks that I just mentioned, have to do with being able to pay very close attention to what's happening in your head. So if you can't do that, and when non-meditators generally don't have attention practice, then they can pay attention for 2 seconds and then they start dreaming about cheeseburgers. Whereas the meditators can pay pretty close attention for 30 seconds or more, and then they start dreaming about cheeseburgers too, but it gives us a longer length of time in doing the actual task, and that's why we think they do better. So this was published last year in Physics Essays. What we've done since then is we've done these experiments again to see if we can replicate it. And there's an example of the actual pattern that you see with a double slit and a single slit. And this is nice because you can model this very precisely using making believe that light acts as a wave. So there's our model. There's the actual data overlaid with the model, and it's very, very close. And this allows us to look at the study, since we know that we got a significant result, and look in the mathematics and say, what must have happened physically in order for us to get these results? So when you do that exercise, first of all, you can say that under the relaxed condition, what you're getting is as though there's the same amount of light going through each slit, and it produces this nice pattern. And if you concentrate, it is as though the amount of light changes. It becomes more light in one slit than the other, and this, of course, changes the interference pattern. That's what the mathematical model says. It doesn't mean that that is what happened, but the value of the mathematics here is that it allows us to look at what's happening in the system in a way that you can't look at directly. You can infer it. So we're continuing to do this kind of research. We also have a version of this that's running on the web 24/7, and people access it through a web browser where you get feedback on your result. And we did this because, and this, by the way, is a picture of little green dots showing people around the world who have done the test from almost everywhere. This allows us to test whether proximity makes a difference. And my starting assumption was that proximity doesn't make a difference because we're talking about awareness, which in the model here is prior to space-time. In fact, all psychic phenomena do not seem to depend very much on proximity. So here's the effect sizes of, in this case, there's 2,000 sessions, and it's from 4 kilometers to 18,000 kilometers away from us. And it shows there's a significant decline in the slope, which is what we predict, but it's completely flat in terms of the intercept. So we know that distance doesn't make any difference, and yet the effect is still seen, even up to 18,000 kilometers, which from here is approximately South Africa. So this will come out in Physics Essays later in the year. So what does this do then this tells us a little bit about what's going on in terms of the mind, but what happens when you have many minds involved? Many, many minds, and in particular that the ducks are in the row, that you get an alignment of minds. Do you get an effect? Well, from a model of idealism, as I said, that if there's something about awareness that you get a lot of it that's becoming coherent at that level, then this coherence might ripple upwards. And so we're looking at contexts like this or contexts like this. So this is Burning Man 2013, and the man is actually burning. And we did an experiment there. So here's the playa. There's 65,000 people there. The Burning Man's right smack in the center. Here's what the Burning Man structure looked like this year. It's like a big UFO structure with a man on top. This is August 31st, 1 minute before 9 p.m. People knew that the man would be burned at 9 p.m. This is the primary ritual at the Burning Man festival. So everyone at this point is 1 minute before the ceremony begins. There's a rising amount of coherent attention. This is 29 seconds after 9 p.m. So imagine you're with 65,000 other people, you're all staring at this thing, waiting for something to happen. In previous years, what would happen is there'd be a big explosion, and the thing, and the whole burning thing would start. But that didn't happen here. What happened was that the man's arms went up a little bit. And then a number of seconds later, the man's arms are still going up. So we're now a whole minute after 9 o'clock. And here we are a minute and a half almost after 9 o'clock, and all that happened was that the man's arms went from down to up. 39 minutes later, the man is ignited. And then 45 minutes afterwards, you get the big flame. So if you think about what's happening here, and by the way, when the flame is happening, there are also fireworks, and there's lots of distractions at that point. So the point at which most of the attention would occur would be probably at 9 o'clock, when people expected something to happen, and everyone got real excited when the arms started going up. So we had 6 random number generators on the playa from 4 different types of devices, 3 sources of randomness: radioactive decay, electron tunneling, and the decision that a photon would make when it bounced off a half-silvered mirror. This is the places where we had the generators, 2 in each of these spots on the playa. The generators are designed, as I said before, to produce truly random sequences of bits with no relationship at all. And the hypothesis then in this case is that if there's some primordial awareness that's getting into alignment as a result of the attention, then maybe there's some coherence that is created. So first of all, we check to make sure that the generators are operating as expected, and you look at an autocorrelation. This looks at the degree of relationship from one bit to the next over the course of the experiment, in which in this case was 2 hours, an hour leading up to the burning and an hour afterwards. And you get very close to 0. So these are very good random generators. So we're going to look at the cross-correlation among the behavior of the 6 generators in 20-minute segments. So we take 20 minutes, look at cross correlations, move it over a second, move it over a second, and keep doing that, and we'll go up to 9 o'clock, past 9 o'clock, and so on. So we'll look at that. We'll look at similar random number generators running elsewhere in the world at the same time. Those generators in the Western Hemisphere, the generators in the Eastern Hemisphere, the combination of the ones at Burning Man and the Western Hemisphere, and then the overall results. So the cross correlation among the 6 generators at Burning Man is this. A few seconds after 9 o'clock, roughly 20 seconds, you get this huge rise in correlation among the randomness. You shouldn't have any correlation among randomness, but nevertheless you get it. It's highly statistically significant. The correlation is almost 0.4. At the same time, there were approximately 50 other generators running around the world in these locations. These are the Western Hemisphere ones. The eye is Burning Man. So we had 19 other generators running in the Western Hemisphere and 25 in the Eastern Hemisphere. If you just look at the 19 that were running in the Western Hemisphere, it turns out you get a spike basically at the same time, about 9 o'clock. It's a lot smaller in magnitude. We had almost 0.4 at Burning Man, and here we have 0.14. This is the Eastern Hemisphere generators. You don't get much of an effect now. And see, the magnitude is like the maximum here is 0.04. So the 25 Burning Man generators plus the Global Consciousness Project generators, you end up with that. And when you do the statistics on it, it's actually 2 billion to 1 odds against chance that you would get a spike of that magnitude at that time. And again, I remind you that this is approximately what it took to get the Nobel Prize for the Higgs boson. So what do we conclude from all this? Was Buddha just a nice guy? Well, I would say he's probably more than just nice. In another version of this talk, I compare him to George Clooney as a movie star. Was it charisma? Did he know how to work a crowd? It was probably more than that. So what Patanjali wrote about, what other mystical traditions write about, and what in a sense is the core of many religions, that some of these stories are true. They're probably not true to the extent that they bubble down through history because they're embellished, but there's a core of it which is true. So I talk about this in great gory detail in my book Supernormal, which after this session this morning I'll be able to sign down in the bookstore. And with that, I thank you very much with 20 seconds left. Thank you.
Thank you.